Yes?
In speaking to judgment, I'm just wondering your thoughts about the dissonance between personal and public lives, and I think we've just seen that in New York with the governor there, but when we look at candidates, is it fair for us to assess their personal lives as things have gone on and weigh that into how we view them as a potential leader?
It's not only fair these days, it's imperative, because the media decreasingly recognizes the difference between private behavior and public behavior. It's worthwhile up to a point. On matters of, let's just say, fundamental integrity, if somebody tells me something, is that person telling me the truth? I think that's a value system that does carry over from the private life to the public life. And you want to know if your president says something that he or she is not lying. And if this person has a history of lying to his or her friends, that's not a good recommendation. Now, having said that, I think there are occasions when a president might be called upon to lie. I mean, suppose during the Second World War, a reporter had the temerity and the poor judgment to ask, "Mr. President, is the D-Day invasion going to begin tomorrow?" Okay, well, if a president said even no comment, that gives something away. So a president might well decide that he can save lots of lives by saying, "Oh no, it's not going to happen for another 6 months," even if he knows perfectly well that it is going to happen the next day. So one can justify that division between a private code of ethics and a public code of ethics. Now, in fact, though, I think this division on certain quality traits can be distinct and probably is important. In fact, in one of the talks that I gave yesterday or the day before, I talked about how certain qualities that can be very admirable in individuals are not admirable at all. In fact, they're counterproductive in presidents. And these include such things as personal loyalty. And I cited examples of presidents who kept people in their cabinets out of reasons of personal loyalty far past the time when these individuals had become burdens on the administration and on the country. And so, I mean, we could have an interesting discussion of this, but I happen to think that Harry Truman hung on Dean Acheson too long. Because Dean Acheson, who was a very important Secretary of State, became an enormous political liability to Truman. After Acheson demonstrated that, well, first of all, he looked down on most members of Congress, which is not particularly a good thing when your Secretary of State has to go and testify before Congress. And Dean Acheson refused to distance himself from Alger Hiss. After Alger Hiss was revealed, or at least alleged at that point, and subsequently it became clear this was true, that he was a Soviet spy. Okay, so people who didn't like Truman's policy could focus on Acheson, and the policy then was burdened with all of the animosity toward Acheson, and the policy wasn't judged on its own merits alone. Now, Truman, for a variety of reasons, some of them being personal loyalty, stuck with Acheson. He's my guy, and I'm going to stick by my friends. Okay, that's a fine trait in an individual, and you ought to stick by your friends through adversity. But if you're President of the United States, there are other issues that can come into play. And here I give, and I did give, I think an example where it becomes clearest is on something like this, where if you personally want to be a pacifist, if you adopt a philosophy of nonviolence, regardless of what my enemies do to me, I will turn the other cheek. I will not answer violence with violence. That's fine, and I can consider that quite admirable. Okay? But if that's your attitude, if that's your private code of ethics, you have no business at all running for President of the United States. Because the President of the United States must not be a pacifist. The President of the United States is responsible for the lives and welfare of 300 million people. And if an enemy attacks the United States, you cannot simply turn the cheek of the United States, because that will allow lots of people to die. So there are certain areas in which a private code of ethics should match up with a public code of ethics. There are others where allowances need to be made for the different realms. Other questions? Yes?
One last question.
Okay. With the possibility of our first female president, can you make any comments about differences between female and male leadership?
It's hard to say in the context of American society, because it hasn't happened yet. For a long time, women's advocates would contend, not all, but a lot of them would contend, if we just made women leaders, then the world would experience peace for the first time. Because it's all these guys who just insist on causing wars. So when women run the world will know peace. Most other major countries, a lot of other major countries have had women leaders. And they have not been notably less violent in their policies than male leaders. And in some cases, if you wanted to, I suppose, you could call this overcompensation, where Golda Meir was as tough as any other Israeli prime minister in defending the interests of Israel. Indira Gandhi was as hard-nosed as could be in dealing with Pakistan and India's other potential enemies. In fact, I mean, I'll repeat this, it might sound mildly sexist, but you can decide whether it does. Except it's hard to say which sex it's sexist against. But when Indira Gandhi was in the cabinet, she wasn't yet prime minister, but it was the time of one of the recurrent wars between India and Pakistan. And she took the hardest line of anybody. And so people got to describing Indira Gandhi as the only man on a cabinet of old women. So, but anyway, it's hard to say in an American context whether a woman would make any difference as a woman.